Welcome, and thank you for joining us. I am Sarah McMullin from Janek Performance Group, and we're here bringing you a webinar on a topic that we've had requests from and questions about from many of our clients, many sales leaders that we work with, and that is account planning. Now, let me give you a few notes before we begin. First, the format for today's webinar is going to be two parts. Presenter Nick Kane is going to be doing, a presentation style session at the beginning, followed by a Q&A. You'll see at the bottom of your screen that there's a Q&A button there. If you have questions for Nick that you want to talk about in that Q&A portion, and I'm sure they're going to come out throughout the course of the presentation, please use the Q&A feature to submit those questions. We want to be able to get to as many as we can, and that is the best possible way for us to see them. Second, this webinar is being recorded, and everybody who registered will receive a copy of that recording emailed to them with that same email address they used to register for the webinar. So keep a lookout for that email. Additionally, it will be on Janek's YouTube channel, and of course, we encourage you to share it with everybody in your network. Finally, in that follow-up email to this presentation, you'll get the recording. You'll also get a link to a survey that Janek is conducting with Selling Power. Nick is going to talk a little bit more about that, so keep an eye out for that email. There's a lot of important information there, including the recording and the link to this survey. Now, let me officially welcome you to today's presentation, Supercharged Account Planning, Strategies and Best Practices for Maximizing Client Relationships. Nick Kane, Managing Partner of Janek Performance Group, is going to be our presenter today. Janek is a leading sales performance company that serves thousands of clients worldwide, from startups to Fortune 500s. We've delivered thousands and thousands of trainings with our validated, research-backed, award-winning, you can see all those awards on the slide, award-winning solutions that drive sales results. And let me introduce Nick. Nick Kane is Managing Partner at Janek Performance Group. Nick has personally trained more than 15,000 sales professionals over the course of his career. His passion is helping those sales professionals enhance their skills, elevate their careers, and ultimately positively impact their lives. You may also know Nick as the co-author of Critical Selling. He's also a regular contributor to Training Industry and Selling Power. Nick, welcome. Welcome to our session today.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Great to be here.
It's great to see you. Without too much preamble, let me hand the time over to you for our presentation today, Supercharged Account Planning, Strategizing. Okay, I knew I was going to get that wrong. Supercharged Account Planning, Strategies and Best Practices for Maximizing Client Relationships.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, for the introduction and the warm words there as well. It is so nice to be here with all of you today. I'm incredibly excited about this topic. As Sarah mentioned, account planning, account growth, relationship maximization is something we're hearing from sales leaders consistently, especially with the changing economic times. How can we maximize revenue without consistent reliance on new leads and marketing to generate new opportunities from new leads we're not consistently working today in terms of our accounts? So we're going to spend some time today digging into this concept of account planning. I'll break down the components of account planning, why we account plan. Again, really excited to be here with you today and to share our best practices and our point of view around this incredibly important subject. So let's start off by first talking about why we account plan. Right? Why do we do this as a sales organization? Why is it valuable to us? And I'll share some stats that I think would be eye-opening if you're not currently formally account planning on a consistent basis. So the first thing I'll mention is we account plan because it maximizes revenue by identifying potential sales opportunities within the account. So the idea of account planning is primarily focused on existing accounts. We have some level of relationship with them. How can we maximize those relationships? And a big part of account planning is understanding potential opportunities within those accounts. It also helps improve customer satisfaction because you're better equipped to build deeper relationships, to understand the needs of your customer, to understand the needs of the contacts within your accounts. We're going to get into that in a second. And ultimately, it does help create stickier customers, if you will, right? The better you know your customer, the more deeply you are involved and entrenched within that organization, the more effective you can be in retaining those customers. It enhances customer retention as well, because it does, again, help you develop deeper relationships and ultimately heightens customer satisfaction as well. And then lastly, it also provides a clear direction and a roadmap for account growth. If you're not doing this on a formal way, you're kind of just, looking for opportunities here and there, doing it informally. It's much more challenging to be consistent in terms of how you approach your accounts and those relationships. And certainly it helps with forecasting as well from your existing relationships. But there's always a challenge from a sales leadership perspective. How do we forecast sales, and how do you forecast sales differently for existing accounts as you would, net new customers that you're trying to go after? So I'll share a few quick stats that I found eye-opening as I was doing some research on this. The Strategic Account Management Association, SAMA, did a survey in 2019, and they confirmed in that survey that 73% of the respondents reported that strategic account planning had a positive impact on their company's revenue growth, right? So that 73%, so an overwhelmingly positive number of those respondents said it improved company revenue and growth. 71% of those responses reported an increase in profitability as a result of implementing a strategic account planning process. 87% of those respondents reported that the customer relationships had improved deeply as a result of implementing an effective account management strategy. So again, it reinforces those points I mentioned earlier. It deepens relationships, strengthens those relationships, improves revenue, improves customer satisfaction. Sales Management Association did a similar survey in 21, looking for different results, right? And what they found is companies that use account planning are much more likely to achieve sales goals, and they have higher win rates than those that do not. Specifically, they found that companies that engage in strategic account planning have a 24% higher win rate overall, 24% higher win rate, and they're 30% more likely to achieve their sales goals than companies that don't formally account plan. So clearly there's a strong business case for it. There's a strong outcome that you see, 24% higher win rate. I think most organizations would welcome that with open arms. All right, so with that said, we talked about why we account plan. We'll get into the components of account planning in a second and how we view account planning as well. Before we do that, let's talk a little bit about how we define account planning, because account planning is a crucial component. So it typically involves identifying and targeting key accounts within your portfolio. We'll talk about that a little bit, like how do you determine what accounts to go after? There may be some questions that come up through the Q&A from today's webinar on that as well. So you know your accounts initially. You need to then gain a deep understanding of those accounts, the industry, the marketplace. What are some of the changes going on? So really knowing your account deeply, knowing the contacts within your account deeply as well. So really understanding who those contacts are, what their individual needs are. Again, we'll talk about this in a few minutes as well on another slide that I have today. And then ultimately, once you know the account deeply, you know your contacts, and there's certain points within that I'll mention. Now you have to start to formulate and understand what your strategy is within that account. And then ultimately that leads towards successful outcomes. So it really comes down to knowing your account, knowing your contacts, knowing your strategy, and then that drives towards account management success. So before we get into the components of an effective account plan, I wanted to take a minute and just talk about what are some of the challenges that we see organizations face when they seek to implement an effective account planning strategy. So the first one I wanted to talk about is getting the team to buy in to that account management strategy and conducting those activities. So here's what we commonly see from sales leaders that I communicate with is, number one, it's difficult because where does the priority lie, right? Without having clear communication and clearly a seller understanding the value of these activities, they're going to prioritize other tasks like following up with new leads that marketing might have generated. They also might view some of these tasks as administrative tasks that can seem tedious, right, or not really worth their time. So it's really important that we're getting the team to buy into these activities, and they need to understand why they're important. Another one is time management. I mean, truly, account planning does require some dedicated time, and it's important to think about every organization is a bit different. Most organizations, the rule of thumb is your sort of top 10% of your accounts, top 5, top 10, up to top 20% get a formal account plan, and perhaps there's some informal activities that happen for lesser valued opportunities or lesser valued accounts. But even still, it requires a dedicated amount of time. And as we know, sales professionals are busy, and there's a lot of activities they want to engage in. And this is just one of those things they have to figure out from a time perspective. And it can also be difficult for a seller to really understand where they should be spending their time, right? How to prioritize their time. Another one I would mention is the customer's willingness to engage in some of these activities. And if we're going to conduct formal account planning, we really need customer advocates and champions within those organizations that are willing to share information, that are willing to give us the face time and the meeting time that we need. So I think that's really important. And then lastly is this new sort of, relatively new, the last few years, remote selling environment. This can be a challenge or an advantage, right? Depending on your sales environment, depending on your industry, depending on your customer expectations. But in some ways, it might be difficult to get, all the people involved, all the stakeholders involved. Perhaps it might be easier. So just something to think about is how do you manage account planning in this new, very dynamic, remote selling environment that we're in today? So let's talk about the components of an account planning strategy. Okay, I've laid these out. These are 5 components that I wanted to talk through today. So the first one is understanding who the key client contacts are within the organization. So you have to know each client, right? And you have to know them deeply and ultimately individually, right? I think that's where some sales professionals fall short, and perhaps even sales leadership in terms of accountability for the account plans. Is it's really important to understand who your contacts are, what is their role in the decision-making process and the overall relationship, let's say, right? Not everything is simply a decision, but what is their role of influence? Are they the decision maker? Are they the economic buyer? Are they someone that's simply an influencer? Are they just supporting information gathering? Just clearly understanding that, but then also understanding the individual needs of that contact within the organization is crucial in supporting, an effective account planning strategy. You also need to know your account deeply, right? So understanding the needs and the goals of your account are critically important. You also need to understand, what is the account strategy here? What is the potential of this account from a revenue perspective? What is the account's current level of penetration within the account? How deep are we? How wide are we? And what is the strategy overall? So really understanding the account at a deep level, I think, is important. Understanding the competition is critically important as well when you're talking about account planning strategy. So who else are they working with? What are they purchasing from them? What do they like about them? What do they not like about them as much? How do they view us from a favorite position? So it's really important to understand, again, not just our account strategy, but who else are they working with and how do we compete and stack up? That's really where having an advocate internally comes into play, having people within the organization that are willing to share that information in partnership to make sure that we can provide the right solutions for our clients. I'll also mention that it's important to create alignment, right? So once we know this information, we know our contacts, we know our account strategy, we know how our competition fares, then it's really important to understand how we start to identify needs and tie those needs to potential solutions for that client, creating alignment of those needs with our solutions and our objectives, right? So that takes time. That might be a team effort, depending on your sales environment. That might require a solution architect internally, really thinking through and how are you creative in solving a customer's challenges, right? Like not everything is just as simple as a simple solution, right? It's important to take time to think through and get creative around how can I help my customer solve problems and challenges. And that, again, many cases requires a team effort and an approach to do that. And then lastly is to have a specific action plan, right? With priorities. What actions do I want to take within this account? Is this a growth account? Am I trying to maintain this account? Really understand what that action plan should be, but then also how do I mobilize that account plan? Who do I need to get involved from my organization? Is there a top-to-top meeting that perhaps I need to schedule with my executive team and their executive team if I'm in a sales role, right? So really thinking through what that account strategy is, how am I adding value to the relationship, and then start to put those those steps in place so you can, like I said, mobilize it, prioritize it, and start taking action on that plan. So again, those are, to me, the 5 key components, and certainly there's layers beneath that as well. So let's talk a little bit about some of the critical activities that support an account planning strategy. And this, to me, is where there's some blurred lines here between sales and certainly marketing. Interested to hear if there's any questions come in around marketing and how marketing supports account planning that is going on within organizations as well. But the first point I want to talk about is this idea of research, data, and KPIs. Data is certainly key, right? Like, we know that sales professionals, if you're going to expand accounts, there's a lot of consideration in doing that, right? It is working within the organization that you're already selling into, right, is one consideration. Something to think about. Is it expanding horizontally within that organization to other departments, other regions within that organization? Is it selling the same solutions to the same audience? Is it selling new solutions to the same audience? Is it selling to different audiences? All of those things have to be considered within that account strategy. And if you are expanding to other contacts, which you likely are, right, depending on the organization and the size of that organization, there's different ways to go about that. And data is going to be critically important to support that. If you have BDRs or SDRs within an organization that are tied to accounts or tied to sales professionals, what data, where do they get the data? How do they start to do that outreach? So having a database tool like ZoomInfo or Seamless.ai or some of those tools might be incredibly useful to support that outreach. If sellers are doing it, again, certainly an incredibly useful tool. LinkedIn Sales Navigator can be a vital tool to those activities as well. How do we find new contacts? How do we prioritize those contacts? And how do we start to expand the relationship? Right, so that's the first point I'll mention is you need to have the data to support that. Another thing to consider too, and again, I'm not sure how many organizations that are on today are doing this, but if you're implementing an effective ABM or account-based marketing strategy, you really should think through how marketing and an ABM could support that with intent data, right? Again, tools like ZoomInfo and other tools, 6sense and some others, offer intent data that can help us prioritize where we spend our time in terms of outreach and how we expand those relationships. So something to think about as well from a alignment of marketing and sales strategy is how do we prioritize those activities and how does marketing support those activities with data, tools, and other potential analytics. KPIs are also incredibly important, right? You have to establish those to determine success of your account planning activities. Obviously, we know the old adage, inspect what you expect, right? So really make sure that you're setting up key metrics around activity, around conversion from outreach to pipeline, from pipeline to conversion and customer lifetime value, and those sort of common KPIs that you should be considering. But it's really important to think about, okay, I want to implement this account planning strategy. Perhaps there's ABM that supports it, perhaps it's BDRs. How do I measure the success of that in my marketing automation tool, in my CRM? Really thinking that through is going to be critical so you can course correct. You can guide the roadmap differently. Certainly on having an understanding of that is going to be key. Tracking data on customer activity and engagement could also be really important as well, or really useful. If you're not, doing some sort of lead scoring right now, assigning point value for activity or something along those lines that you want to engage with those prospects and even your existing accounts, you should be, right? Think about what your lead scoring strategy should be and start to use that data to help sales professionals prioritize their outreach within their existing accounts. I'll share a quick stat that came out from Corporate Executive Board. They found that companies that use KPIs to measure and track the effectiveness of account planning activities specifically were 20% more likely to hit their sales targets than those that didn't. Right? So again, huge gap there, tremendous opportunity. If you're not thinking about how you're measuring those activities, it's time to do so. The next point I'll mention is communication and collaboration. I think this is really important. If you think about your sales organization, this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about getting buy-in and tracking the results of the account planning strategy and being really clear on what those activities should be. So it's important to make sure you're clearly communicating and collaborating across the sales organization, make sure everybody's aligned on their goals and on the objectives of the activities, but also on the account plan itself, right? In many cases, account planning is a team effort, It's not something that just a sales professional is going to engage in. Again, it could be a BDR that supports it. It could be the sales professional. It could be the sales leader. It could be a solution architect or a technical expert. So by having clear communication and putting the account plan in a central place where it's visible, I think that typically helps organizations and those individual teams collaborate more effectively and certainly communicate across the team who's doing what and who's responsible for what. Right. It also helps create awareness of, as I mentioned, the roles and responsibilities of those that are in that account planning process. And that helps promote accountability within that, right? It tries to reduce finger pointing. If there's certain members of the team that are responsible for certain components of that account plan, I think the more clear the communication is, the better. And then the last thing I'll mention too is effective communication around this is going to help create the value or help establish the value for those activities. We want to reduce roadblocks. We want to establish a practical approach to account planning that fits in within a sales professional or the sales team's schedule, right? Where we're asking them in a practical way to conduct these activities. How you communicate that and how you explain and share the value is going to be key in making sure that these activities happen and they're being conducted on a consistent basis, right? So again, a key point around communication. Setting goals and objectives, right, is another sort of best practice that I'll mention as well. We think it's important that you're setting clear objectives for the account plan. You're setting objectives. That helps the team stay focused on what is most important, understanding those priorities, and it allows the team to measure progress and success against the plan. We may go into the year thinking about, these 5 accounts or these 10 accounts are what we need to focus on. Things might change, right? So by understanding the objectives within that account and the activities that we need to conduct to make sure that we're moving and implementing and executing that account plan effectively, that target could move, right? And that, the goalpost could extend, right, or change. So it's really important that we're looking at that. We're setting objectives. We understand what our goals are with that plan, and we're putting some time-bound, consistent elements to that to make sure that we are following that, and we are, again, cutting losses where it doesn't make sense, and we're continuing to invest time where it does. And the last thing I'll mention is to keep it fresh. And what I mean by that is review your account plans on a consistent basis. We're in a very unique economic time right now. Things are rapidly changing. You can't put an account plan in place and just conduct those activities and just revisit it next year. I mean, you really should be looking at this on a very consistent basis, depending on the structure of the sales, of the accounts, if you will, or the level of sophistication. You may want to look at this as often as every 30 days, every 90 days, right? But you want to look at this as consistently as possible. Markets are changing, industries are changing. I would set a consistent, plan for review of this and try to make that review as simple and as streamlined as possible. I'll mention that is another pitfall that I see with sales organizations. These reviews and the QBRs and that sort of thing, these are necessary, don't get me wrong, but there's ways to streamline that process, to get the data that you need, to not be duplicative in what you ask a seller to do. I mean, I would really want to consider all of those things to make sure that we're maximizing efficiency, and we are putting our sellers in the best position to maximize their time. Because the last thing a sales professional wants to do is enter the same data numerous times in numerous places. That is discouraging and a deterrent to having them execute the activities and plan that we want them to execute. So again, just something to think about as you're thinking about the plan, but also how you're asking sales professionals to report progress on those plans from a sales leadership standpoint. Okay, great. So that primarily summarizes the main points that I wanted to share with you around account planning, some of the pitfalls, some of the key components of account planning. We're going to open it up to Q&A here in just a minute. But before we do that, I did want to mention that we are currently conducting a research study with Selling Power around this very subject, around managing existing accounts and growing relationships. We're in the process of conducting that survey now. So if you wanted to contribute to that information, we would love for you to do that. You could take a quick picture of the QR code that we're sharing on the screen today. We're also going to drop the link of this in the Zoom invite as well, so you can review it later. If you're able to contribute and spend some time, it's not going to take a whole lot of time to contribute to this. I would say, 10 minutes, 15 minutes max. If you're able to spend some time doing that, we will provide a copy of the findings in the report once that's published in the next 60 days or so. So again, we encourage that. We would love your input if you wanted to spend some time doing that as well.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks for your thoughtful presentation. But as you said, we're going to be moving into the Q&A portion of this webinar. We did receive quite a few questions. I've done my best to kind of group them together topically so they make the most sense. I think I've done a pretty good job, but I guess you'll be the judge of that. Our participants will be the judge of that. Also, for our participants, if you haven't added a question yet, be sure to drop it into that Q&A. We may be able to get to it, and if not, we can have somebody from Janek reach out to you or connect with you about any additional questions you might have. So the first question that we have is about customer segmentation. What role does customer segmentation play in account planning?
Yeah, that's a great question. It plays a vital role, right? I think as we think through the customers that we want to go after, one of the early steps in an account planning strategy is thinking about what accounts we want to go after. And there's a variety of criteria that I would recommend using around that, but ultimately it's level of strategic growth opportunity within that account. It's those that are most likely to value our value proposition. Just really taking time to select the right accounts to go after, I think is going to be key there. And then from there, once you have a list of criteria to identify who we should target, then it's a matter of, yes, going into the database, segmenting those customers out, thinking about, at what threshold do we want to do that? Again, is it the top 5%, top 10%? And then start to implement the strategy from there. But yeah, segmenting customers, I would say, is one of the earliest activities that should be engaged in.
One of the most common questions we got in various forms, I feel like probably a third of the questions asked a question about time and time management. How much time is required of sellers to properly account plan?
This really does. This is a question we get all the time, right? How much time should sales professionals invest? And it really does vary by industry and by size of account and ultimately the level of revenue potential within those accounts. But I would say as a threshold, we typically see as much as a half a day per week is spent on this. 4 to 6 hours, let's say, of time is spent on account planning strategy and activities. Certainly could be longer if you're a true account manager and you're not responsible for new business development at all. Certainly a much higher percentage of your time is spent in that regard. But for those that are responsible for both types of activities, we typically see anywhere from again 4 to 8 hours per week spent on account planning and account management strategies.
So you touched a bit about this in your presentation, but we want to dive a little bit more deeply. So what are some of the best practices for collaborating with other teams, right? Sales teams don't operate in a vacuum. So what are your recommendations for collaborating with teams such as marketing, client services, product to create that comprehensive plan?
Yeah. I think a lot of that comes down to the visibility across the account plan itself, clear communication, and a clear understanding of roles and responsibilities within that account planning strategy, right? I think to me, those are the three components. If you're clearly communicating who's responsible for what, if there's visibility to the plan, and there's regular meetings, right, between cross-departmental functions within the organization, that typically is going to increase the success rate of implementing that account strategy and getting the results you want. It does pose challenges, right? Like we see departments within organizations have some headbuttings at times going on, right? So it's really important. I think the more visible that strategy is, the better the communication around the value. I think that tends to increase the likelihood of success across the team.
And I'll say, as somebody on the marketing side, I know that when those teams are in constant collaboration and constant conversation, getting on that same page, aligning around what the strategy is and who you're targeting makes everybody's job not only easier, but the conflict and the collaboration and the just general function of both teams is so much better and so much more effective.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
So how would you, Nick, prioritize and allocate resources based on the potential value of an account?
Yeah, again, I think a lot of this comes down to clear communication. It's a great question. A lot of this is around priorities and time management, which are all really important. A lot of it, I think, comes down to the communication plan and also having leadership prioritize where sellers should be spending their time. I think, to me, that seems to be the biggest hurdle. Sales professionals have their accounts, and a lot of it depends on the number of accounts they manage. If it's 5 or 10, I think it's pretty clear. But when account managers start to manage, 50, 100 accounts, it's difficult sometimes to understand the priority within those activities. And a lot of times you're just looking for that low-hanging fruit, reacting to account requests versus like being proactive and strategically going after those accounts. So I think it's just a matter of, identifying who are the accounts that we should be going after. Let's come up with a practical plan to implement that strategy, right? And then I think from there, prioritization becomes a bit easier, right? But I think it's a lot of that legwork you do up front is going to help a sales professional understand how to prioritize team members within the account, right, as well as their own activities.
So kind of along with that, we know that there can be a different level of resources required, different level of engagement, and it really is kind of a different way of looking at planning in advance and the way you assess success within strategic account planning versus kind of the day-to-day and immediate pipeline. So one of the questions here is, how frequently should you assess and how frequently should you be adjusting account-based plans on changing market conditions, customer needs, success?
Yeah, I think many of the clients we partner with today are looking at their account plans as often as every 30 days. It depends on how volatile of a market or industry you're operating in. If you have to course correct that quickly, that could be fast for some organizations. Like, it takes time to implement an effective strategy. Some sales cycles could be 2+ years or longer. So that it really does depend on the organization and the size of accounts they're managing and they're going after. But we see it as frequently as every 30 days. At a minimum, it's usually every 90 days to 6 months. Again, it just depends on that organization and what's going on in their industry.
And I imagine that has to be adaptable to market conditions, for example, economic conditions, that you maybe would fast forward that assessment or be quick and responsive in your assessment based on the pressures within your organization and on your customers as well.
Yeah, I think account planning as an activity is more important now than ever, right? Especially with some of the changes we see. Some changes in the economy, budgets are getting cut in a lot of industries, layoffs are happening, which is making it more challenging from a new business development perspective in some ways. Not all industries, of course, but in some industries, right? But we have these existing accounts and these relationships that we know more deeply or should know more deeply, right? So we should be able to understand that organization, deepen relationships within those organizations. We have our foot in the door, and the cost to acquire those additional dollars, let's say, within that organization or expand those relationships should be less, ideally, and should be a bit easier, right? So yes, I would say the short answer is economically it's important. I think it's more vital than ever. How can we grow relationships and expand those relationships today to better serve our customers?
I imagine that's why we've been getting so many questions and continue to get more questions about this topic, is developing the relationships we have, maximizing those relationships, and just really looking at being responsive to market conditions. Yeah. So let's say you're discussing, you have been in a leadership position for a long time. We experience this is a question here, we experience some pushback when we discuss account planning with our reps. What do you suggest we do to help with that? Yeah,
I think number one, I think we need to be clear as a leadership team within an organization on the value of the account planning activities. And so number one is, how can I clearly articulate the value proposition around these activities, right? Like, if we just tell sales professionals to do things like any other employee within an organization, okay, will they do it? Sure. Some will, most will. Are they going to want to do it? Probably not, right? Like, so I think we have to clearly articulate the value proposition. I think we have to look at these activities as practically as possible, right? It's no different than how we look at when we're training an organization and we're sustaining skills afterward. If we ask a sales professional to do a bunch of activities that cuts into true sales time and they view it as tedious administrative work, they're going to be less engaged and they're going to want to do it far less, right? So I just think the more practical you can look at the plan, the better you can enable it with tech, right? So there's less, again, data entry in multiple places, like really thinking through the tech stack, really enabling a seller to be effective with this by giving them practical responsibility and accountability is, again, done in a very practical way. I think those two combined to be most effective, right? Like what's in it for me and how can I enable them to do this in the easiest way possible where it's still an effective strategy?
I think that actually leads really nicely into this next question, which is that short-term revenue, long-term relationships, and again, kind of having time to do both. So how do you balance that need, both as a seller and also as a leader, balancing that need for short-term revenue versus long-term relationship creation and sustainment when you're creating account plans?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we think that within account plans, there tends to be an opportunity to find some sort of low-hanging fruit. Like there's probably some immediate wins we can find within an account if we have the right processes in place and we have the right contacts within an organization. Ideally, you want to create some short wins that make investing time within that account that much more valuable. But account planning can be sort of a long game, right? Like sometimes we want immediate revenue from these activities. And depending on the organization and the industry, that can happen. Sometimes it's not, right? So there is a balance, right, with level of time invested, especially as you're bringing in multiple team members with this. And that's why I come back to regular check-ins, understanding our objectives and goals, knowing what we're trying to accomplish in a realistic time frame. I think we have to, as leaders, we have to think through, okay, what is realistic? How much time and energy am I willing to invest into this strategy? And then at what point do I go, what is my indicator that says this isn't working? Let's move on to something else.
So you talked a bit about measuring KPIs. You've kind of talked about it all along, including in your presentation. So can you elaborate more on that? Measuring activities and effectiveness, some key metrics to track the success of your account planning results. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think metrics such as looking at the number of accounts being managed individually and start to look at metrics like pipeline created from those accounts, I think is a key element. And if you want to go even further, up the funnel, if you will, you may want to look at any SDR or BDR activity that's happening or sales activity, depending on who you have doing the outreach. But how many appointments are you setting, right, from that outreach to existing accounts, I think could be key. What's the level of activity in terms of outreach to those existing accounts, I think is important to look at too. Emails, phone calls, that sort of thing. But also now moving down the chain of funnel, how many appointments are being set? How many of those appointments show to their appointment, to those calls? Of those appointments that are set, how many dollars of opportunities are being created? What's the number of opportunities being created? What is that conversion rate? How does that compare to other, leads that you might be working within your organization? And then start to work that through the pipeline, right? Like, as you are putting deals in the pipeline, of those, how many are converting to an opportunity? Of those, how many are closing? I think dollars, number of deals won, number of dollars won. I think all those similar metrics that you track in a sales pipeline are key, but also looking at this separately from those accounts that you're managing, I think could perhaps paint a different picture than new leads that you might be working.
I want to skip here to Melissa. She submitted a question a few minutes ago that I think ties nicely into this. So in the case of strategic account management, how many accounts would be the best to target at any given time to be effective and efficient? I have a suspicion that I know kind of what your answer is going to be, but I'd love to hear you talk a bit about that.
That is a great question. Again, I think a lot of it comes down to the revenue responsibility of that sales professional and the size of those accounts. We see some sales professionals that have as few as 2 or 3 accounts. That's it. That's all they manage. They deepen those relationships. They're incredibly rich in revenue per account. So we see it that way. We see organizations where they have, 20, 30, 40 accounts. And they may have more. I think another question to ask is, of the accounts that an account manager manages, how many of those accounts get a formal account plan tied to those accounts? You may still field questions, and you may still manage that relationship, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're investing in strategic activities around that account to grow those relationships in a proactive way. So when you look at that number, you tend to see typically the top 10% of the accounts, 15%, 20% max, where you're conducting a really consistent account management strategy. And many of our clients will implement sort of two account management strategies, one for the top of the top, if you will, top 5 to 15%, and then you might have the next, say 10 to 20% of those accounts get an account plan, but done in a much less formal way.
Let me go here to Brody's question. Brody asked about competition, about getting to know your competition. How is the best way to go about that? Would you be using some of this technology you mentioned? Is that something that you can work with a customer on? And if so, how? Like, what's an appropriate approach for gauging the competition for your strategic accounts?
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of the technology that I mentioned earlier will enable some activity around that. Like, most companies are in these databases and there's general information about those organizations. Certainly conducting research online about those competitors is going to be key. In many cases, we see organizations hiring an outside firm, commonly a marketing or brand agency that has experience in competitive intelligence. And they may go out to the marketplace, you identify your top 5 or 10 competitors, and they'll conduct a thorough assessment around that. Many will even do mystery shopper activities or other things to get further information, right? Depends on how deep you want to go, how you feel about those kind of activities. You see them vary quite a bit. But yeah, I would say at a minimum, leveraging data, doing some searching online, having somebody within an organization put a brief together or battle cards on each of those competitors. And then again, as far as full-blown research that perhaps an outside agency can help you with.
Is competition a concern when you're thinking about your strategic account planning?
Very, very much. Yeah, like you have to know the competitors in the space. Ideally, you have to know who they're working with, what they're purchasing from them, what they like about them, what they don't like about them. A true SWOT analysis of your position is critically important. We talk about that in our critical account planning program that we offer. But yeah, it's really important to understand your differentiators, what they like about you, what they don't like about you, and where you can gain market share, right? Because in many cases, they have somebody else they're working with for similar solutions. How do we take that wallet share from that competitor, right, and continue to expand that relationship? So
what are your thoughts, Nick, on leveraging social media in growing accounts?
I think it's an important component to account planning, to a broader marketing strategy as well. I think LinkedIn is an amazing source of information, and when used properly, could be used for outbound prospecting to support account planning. I think that's one consideration, but just having better visibility and showing up consistently where your people are searching, I think is really important. There are ways to do that from a retargeting and remarketing perspective, from a social perspective, growing that database. A lot of that supports an effective account-based marketing or an ABM strategy as well. So again, we talked about this earlier, that blurred line between marketing and sales has never been more blurred. I mean, to me, I think those departments have to work in sync. I think social is a huge element to support those activities.
One question that has come up a few times, and I'm also going to try and consolidate some of the questions we got here in the chat, which is about internal champions, sticky relationships, connecting with the buying committee. I think depending on the size of the account and the size of the opportunity, that can really fluctuate a lot. So what are your thoughts on the extent of building relationships across the organization, building relationships with those key contacts, and also the movement within organizations? What happens when your key contact takes on another responsibility, kind of that maintaining of relationships within your strategic account with all of these personnel factors?
So important. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I've seen sales professionals have a great relationship with an account, generating consistent revenue with that account, but they have one primary contact they work with or two contacts that they work with. And then what happens? That contact leaves, they move to another organization. And yeah, you can continue with that relationship and perhaps you can make some inroads to that other organization they move to, but now you're stuck scrambling to try to make contacts within that organization. So to me, diversifying your contacts within an organization is so very important. Obviously, working your way up that chain, if you will, is very important as well. But just having multiple contacts and multiple stakeholders that have awareness of your organization, your capabilities, what you do for that organization, what value you provide them is just so very important. And I think sales professionals fall into that trap a little bit, right? Like they build a relationship personally with someone, and from a business perspective, they get to know them. That is their champion, that is their advocate. And then all of a sudden they leave and you're swimming, right? So I think that's one consideration, but also there's never been a time, especially in a B2B environment, but even in many B2C decision-making environments where you have decisions by committee, right? So if you're trying to expand the relationship, you have to make inroads with others and you have to develop champions and advocates. It's not an easy task, right? Like you really have to know them individually. You have to find different ways of connecting with them and adding value, but incredibly important to the account planning strategy.
The flip side of that, a question we got here, the flip side of that is when your sellers are moving and changing and taking on new or different accounts, you as the sales leader, how are you thinking about maintaining those relationships within your strategic account when the seller who owned that account is no longer the one who owns that account?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, it's, there's movement across organizations, right? People leave, people come in. I would say that the more grounded that account is in your capabilities as an organization, the more effective you are. I think that's got to be a strategy as a sales leader that you want to consider, is that relationship has to be deeper than just with the rep, right? Like they have to know the services that are offered and the value that's provided. So I think that's key. And there is an element of keeping things fresh and not stale also. I mean, we see organizations that will rotate accounts every so often. If there isn't activity happening, if there isn't account growth happening, you may want to, even if they're not leaving, you may just want to turn accounts over to others that can start to make inroads and to start to have a new and fresh and different perspective, right? So there is another element of that also. Sometimes that could be a positive thing, right? Depending on the circumstances, but it just goes back to, you have to make sure that you're adding value to that relationship beyond just the seller relationship.
I know within Janek's materials, one thing we really, really emphasize is providing value and this legitimate purpose to all your calls and conversations. How does that apply in these long-term relationships? And how do you continue to provide value throughout the relationship when you're not all, some of those calls and engagements are about the relationship building? How do you make sure that's always going to be valuable?
It's a tough task, especially for long-term relationships. But I think there's a couple ways to do that. One is to think about other team members within your organization and what value could they add. Again, maybe it's a specialist, maybe it's someone that has a certain level of insight that you can provide. Maybe it's a leadership discussion. That would be one consideration, is just other team members to add value. It could be content that you publish, right? And maybe that, there's a point of view on that, or thought leadership that you publish that could add value over time. It could be incentives that you offer, right, that keep a customer engaged and incentivized to manage that relationship. There's a variety. I mean, it's endless, right, to really think through. I think the challenge or the important part is you should be thinking about it. I encourage sales leaders to challenge their sales professionals all the time in the sales process. How are you adding value is no different than in the account planning process. Like, what can you do to keep them engaged and involved, your client contacts? And a lot of that is consistent value messaging and knowing your customer deeply, I would say, right? Like, value is valuable when it's valuable to me, So I think understanding your customer deeply and knowing what they want and what they care about is really important.
I think that's a great point. One more question that came up is, we talked about the internal buy-in with the sellers. Do you ever run into issues with external buy-in and the consideration of long-term accounts versus transactional accounts on the other side, right, with your clients. Do you have issues, or how would you approach this getting buy-in from your customer and building that relationship with your customer early on?
Yeah, I think that's very common. Not every customer is willing, or every account is willing to let you in, so to speak, and like really, let you get involved within the organization and really deeply understand the levels and the players and, key needs and that sort of thing. Many organizations want to keep vendors at arm's length. I think a lot of that comes back to how you've added value. We talk about the concept of trusted advisor, right? And really making sure you're positioning yourself as someone that adds value, that can be insightful, that can share data that's important, and that can help solve problems that customers may have never even thought they had. So in order to more deeply understand and sort of penetrate that account, you have to have added value at multiple levels and delivered on the promises that you made with consistent follow-up. I mean, there's a recipe to success for this, that is, if done well and done consistently, will help open up those doors. But it's not easy. You have to earn the right. You have to win that distinction from your accounts and from your contacts within those accounts. But yeah, pushback happens. I think you just have to keep chipping away at it, keep building trust, and keep adding value. And then eventually they will view you as a partner and let you in.
And not to be too much of a product plug, but we do have a training, critical account planning, a lot of these questions that people talked about, as well as one question that came up about the capability of sellers to be able to evaluate accounts and potential opportunities. I think that's really relevant to that course and that training. So if any attendees want to learn more about that, you can go to our website, you can email us, request more information, and get all the information you want about our critical account planning course. Nick, we're just about 10 till. I wanted to wrap up and give people a little time back for the rest of their day. Thank you so much. Thank you to all our participants who submitted these great questions. It's been an awesome presentation. And Nick, I love that it's so clear that you always focus, you practice what you preach on. How am I adding value? How am I being helpful? And I think it is very valuable and helpful that essentially you're offering all of this, what would be fantastic consulting advice and services that I think people would be happy to get in their organization, and you're just giving it out. And we encourage the attendees to also share that. What are you learning from it? How is this valuable? If you have any additional questions, Nick, I would absolutely recommend connecting with Nick on LinkedIn. I also recommend following Janek on LinkedIn if you're not already following us there. I know a number of you registered because you already follow Janek on LinkedIn. That's often the best way to keep up to date with what do we have going on right now? What kind of new thought leadership do we have coming out right now? You kind of get the quickest view of that, as well as some useful and I think interesting thought leadership. So just a quick reminder, you will get a full copy of today's recording showing up in your email. It'll also be on Janek's YouTube channel. Please watch it, share it. For those of you who weren't able to participate live, we hope that you're enjoying this recording, and again, encourage you to share it and follow us on LinkedIn and other social media. Nick, again, thank you so much. Thank you for your time. It has been a pleasure to be here with you today. And thank you, attendees, on behalf of Janek Performance Group. We'll hope to see you out for our next webinar.
Thanks again.